I'm Jessica with Extraco and Partners with United Way, and today I'm going to be reading you Moostache by Margie Palatini, illustrated by Henry Cole, and this was published in 1997 by Scholastic. Moose had a problem, a horrible, hairy, prickly problem. It grew right below his nostrils and just above his lip. A moustache. Now, not a few hairs or shiny little stubble. No mere weak wandering whiskers upon the upper lip of this moose. No siree. Moose had a big, brushy, bristly, mighty moustache, but a moustache that was burly, snarly, mangy mess, and it itched a lot. Sure, he plucked and tweezed, he even clipped, snipped, and teased, but his combs were still cowards, and his brushes rebelled. His scissors simply surrendered. It just couldn't do the job. Moose was in a frizzy tizzy. The moustache was completely cramping his style. He was a great hoofer, but he could barely bop and hip-hop with the moustache going flip-flop. He couldn't dance. He was a wonderful chef, but he simply could not flambe his souffle with all those whiskers in his way. He couldn't cook. Moose was also a daring skier, but how could he downhill race with that mighty moustache blowing in his face? Moose had to do something, but what? After days and days, much serious thought, Moose got an idea. He crossed some hair here, and he crossed some hair there, and he tied his moustache around his neck. So a moose scarf seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. But then his moustache got knotted and mangled and horribly tangled, and those hundreds of hairs still prickled and tickled. But worse, Moose could barely take a breath with all that moustache wrapped around his neck. So Moose untied, unwrapped, unknotted, and gulped for fresh air. He got another idea. He parted some hair this way, and he parted some hair that way, and he heaped that moustache on top of his head. So he had a moustachioed antlers. Seemed to be the ideal answer to his problem. It was so simple, so easy, so perfectly perfect. Until a squadron of squirrels and one very nosy gopher moved right into the Moose Motel. They huddled and hoarded and furrowed and burrowed. Needless to say, it became quite crowded on Moose's head and a heavy and messy. They all moved in. And very, very noisy. The squirrely, chitty, chatting, squeals, and squawks woke Moose every morning before the crack of dawn. And that gopher was giving the moose one hairy headache. Moose needed his sleep. He needed his rest. He needed his privacy. Moustachioed antlers. Nuts, said the moose. So he unparted, unpiled, untwisted, untwined, and said, adios to the hairy horns. But now what? What? The miserable moose took a hold of a hunk of hair, and he wrestled it, and he roped it, and he tethered it, and tied and tamed it. A moose tail. Now that was so simple, that was so easy, that was not so perfectly perfect. Talk about a dizzy do. Moose didn't know if he was coming or going, forward, backward, this way, that. He didn't know which end was which. Moose had no bail on the tail. He wrapped it around his nose. so he thought and thought and thought some more, but no other idea was a worthy winner. Braids were a bother, a Moostache sweater too sweltering. Net, not. Poor Moose. His problem was truly terrible, unbearable, just downright sad. He felt so alone, he didn't know what else to do. He had braided it and made a scarf and held it with a net. Then, call it fate, call it destiny. It was probably dumb luck, but one day Moose tripped on his Moostache. And just in time, and just had no time to duck. Oomph, pardon me, they both said as they bumped, they blinked and they stared, and their hearts went thump-a-thump. She is a moose with a bouffant, so bodacious, so outrageous, well, it was just plain old big. Bouffant's big hair, a skyscraping dew of glorious curls, a tower of swirling twists and twirls. She was simply splendid, stupendous, absolutely superb. See Moose, and then his girl Moose. Of course, Moose had to ask how she did what she did with such ado. Miss Moose winked and whispered, "Just a little clue." So she helped he fearlessly plunge a hoof into a fat pot of white gooey goop. And carefully, and oh so carefully, they glopped and plopped, they pasted and pressed, they coaxed and curled every truly unruly wayward whisker around and around. They tweaked and twirled those horrible hairs until Moose's once mangy mess was now a wondrous winding wave of marvelous Moostache. Moose gazed in the mirror and smiled a broad moosey smile, and he was so happy, so glad, just giddy with glee. He looked dashing and handsome. Moose gushed, "Is that really me?" With not a care for one hair, the Moose pair boogied and bopped and skied downhill, even uphill, and their cooking was hot, hot, hot. But that Moostache was no longer a problem. So, of course, it wasn't long after that the Moose and his Moostache and his beautiful bride fox-trotted and tangoed and waltzed down the aisle. Good hair days, bad hair days, they vowed to love and to cherish, and with hearts heaped with love and pots filled with goop, they both sighed, "I do," glue, and promised to never part. The end.